In the winter of 1983, a warehouse fire in Detroit consumed more than just concrete and steel. Hidden beneath the flames and smoke was a fortune that would vanish without explanation, leaving behind questions that seemed impossible to answer. No witnesses stepped forward, no arrests followed, and no credible leads emerged from the ashes. For 4 decades, the case remained buried in departmental files, dismissed as another unsolved crime in a city already overwhelmed by violence and economic collapse. But sometimes the past refuses to stay silent. Sometimes a single document, forgotten in the depths of bureaucratic storage, can unravel mysteries that were never meant to be solved. What began as a routine insurance investigation in 1983 became one of Detroit's most perplexing financial crimes. The missing money, the timing of the fire, and the complete absence of evidence created a puzzle that defied every attempt at resolution. Investigators found themselves chasing shadows, following leads that evaporated as quickly as they appeared. The case went cold not because of incompetence or oversight, but because someone had planned it that way. Then, in the spring of 2024, a hospital administrator processing old medical records stumbled upon a discrepancy that would change everything. A single entry in a patient database, cross-referenced against death certificates from decades past, revealed an inconsistency so glaring it demanded immediate attention. The man, listed as deceased in official records, was very much alive, living quietly just miles from where it all began. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. On the evening of February 14, 1983, the Riverside Storage Complex on Detroit's east side appeared no different than any other night. The sprawling industrial facility housed dozens of businesses, from small manufacturing operations to import distributors moving goods through the Great Lakes shipping network. Located in a section of the city that had seen better days, the complex attracted tenants who valued low rent over modern amenities. Security was minimal, surveillance was outdated, and most units operated with little oversight from building management. Unit 47B had been leased 6 months earlier by a company called Northern Logistics, a name that appeared legitimate on paper but had no traceable business activity beyond the rental agreement. The unit measured roughly 3,000 square feet and was positioned in the northeast corner of the building, away from the main loading docks and foot traffic. According to lease documents, Northern Logistics dealt in commercial electronics, computer equipment, and specialized machinery destined for industrial clients across the Midwest. What made Unit 47B unusual wasn't its contents, but the frequency of activity during off hours. Night shift workers at adjacent businesses had noticed delivery trucks arriving and departing between midnight and dawn, always with the same precision and always without paperwork being processed at the main office. The vehicles bore no company logos, carried no visible license plates, and the drivers never interacted with other tenants or security personnel. These nocturnal operations continued for months without attracting official attention. The fire began at approximately 11:30 p.m., originating in what investigators later determined was the electrical system serving the northeast section of the building. Initial reports suggested faulty wiring, a common problem in older industrial structures that had been retrofitted multiple times over the decades. The Detroit Fire Department responded within minutes, but the blaze spread rapidly through the interconnected units, fed by stored materials and inadequate fire suppression systems. By the time firefighters gained control of the situation, Unit 47B and 3 adjacent storage spaces had been completely destroyed. The intensity of the fire in that specific section was noted as unusual, burning hotter and faster than surrounding areas, despite containing what should have been standard commercial inventory. Arson investigators found no accelerants, no evidence of deliberate ignition, and no signs of forced entry. The official determination was accidental fire caused by electrical malfunction. What emerged during the insurance investigation, however, painted a far more complex picture. Northern Logistics had filed a claim for $2.2 million in lost inventory, supported by detailed manifests listing high-end computer servers, telecommunications equipment, and precision manufacturing tools. The claim was substantial but not extraordinary for a business dealing in technical hardware during the early 1980s computer boom. The problem arose when investigators attempted to verify the claimed inventory. Purchase orders submitted by Northern Logistics led to suppliers who had no record of the transactions. Shipping documentation referenced freight companies that had ceased operations months before the alleged deliveries. Invoice numbers corresponded to accounting systems that didn't exist, and serial numbers for the destroyed equipment matched no manufacturer databases. Most troubling was the financial trail. Northern Logistics had paid for its insurance policy with a cashier's check drawn on a Detroit bank account that had been opened specifically for that transaction and closed immediately afterward. The company's business license was legitimate, but had been obtained using a post office box address that was never used for mail delivery. Phone numbers listed in corporate filings connected to disconnected lines, and the registered agent for the company had provided a false Social Security number. Within weeks of filing the claim, Northern Logistics disappeared entirely. The post office box was abandoned, the phone lines went silent, and no one associated with the company could be located. Insurance investigators found themselves pursuing a ghost, chasing paper trails that led nowhere, and following leads that evaporated upon closer examination. The Detroit Police Department opened a parallel investigation, treating the case as potential insurance fraud rather than simple arson. Detectives interviewed other tenants, examined security footage from nearby businesses, and conducted forensic analysis of the fire scene. They discovered that Unit 47B had been accessed using electronic key cards that left no physical trace and required no interaction with building management. The sophisticated entry system had been installed at the tenant's request and expense, ostensibly for security purposes. More intriguing was the discovery of reinforced flooring in Unit 47B, construction that seemed excessive for storing commercial electronics. Core samples taken from the burned foundation revealed concrete poured to unusual specifications, designed to support far more weight than typical warehouse operations would require. Chemical analysis of debris found traces of materials inconsistent with computer equipment, including residues that suggested the presence of precious metals and currency-grade paper fibers. The investigation stalled when every lead reached the same conclusion. Northern Logistics had been a sophisticated shell operation designed to legitimize the storage of something valuable enough to warrant elaborate concealment. The fire, whether accidental or intentional, had destroyed not only the contents of Unit 47B, but any hope of determining what those contents actually were. Insurance adjusters faced an unprecedented dilemma. The claim appeared fraudulent, yet no criminal activity could be proven. The company existed legally, the policy was valid, and the fire was ruled accidental. Without evidence of deliberate deception, the insurance company was obligated to process the claim, but they could not verify the existence of the inventory being claimed. The case entered legal limbo, with insurance attorneys filing motions to delay payment while private investigators continued searching for any trace of Northern Logistics or its principals. Months passed without progress, and by the end of 1983, the file had been transferred to a special investigations unit tasked with handling cases that defied conventional resolution. The missing $2.2 million became a footnote in Detroit's economic struggles, overshadowed by plant closures, municipal budget crises, and rising crime rates. The insurance company ultimately settled for a fraction of the claimed amount, writing off the remainder as an acceptable loss rather than pursuing costly litigation with uncertain outcomes. The warehouse was demolished, The site cleared, and within a few years even the memory of the fire had faded from public awareness. But the questions remained. Who was behind Northern Logistics? What had really been stored in Unit 47B? And how had someone managed to create such an elaborate deception without leaving a single, traceable connection to their real identity? For 41 years, those questions went unanswered. The case file gathered dust in storage. The principals vanished into obscurity, and the mystery seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. Until a routine database cross-reference in 2024 revealed something that changed everything. The discovery that would crack open the decades-old mystery didn't come from seasoned detectives or insurance investigators. It came from Maria Santos, a data analyst at Detroit Medical Center, who was tasked with the mundane job of digitizing patient records from the 1980s and 1990s. The hospital system was modernizing its archives, converting thousands of paper files into searchable electronic databases as part of a federally mandated transition to digital record-keeping. Working through boxes of yellowed documents in a basement storage room, Santos processed admission forms, discharge summaries, and treatment records with mechanical efficiency. Most entries were routine, documenting everything from broken bones to routine surgeries, but one file stopped her cold. The patient intake form was dated March 3, 1983, just weeks after the warehouse fire, and listed a man named Michael Torres who had been treated for severe burns and smoke inhalation. What made the record unusual wasn't the injuries themselves, but the circumstances surrounding Torres's treatment. According to the file, he had been brought to the emergency room unconscious, with no identification and no memory of how he'd been injured. The burns covered 30% of his body, consistent with exposure to intense heat and flames. More significantly, the treatment notes indicated that Torres had been carrying nearly $15,000 in cash when he arrived, money that had been secured in the hospital safe pending his recovery. Santos might have processed the record without a second thought, but she was also a true crime enthusiast who spent her free time reading about cold cases and unsolved mysteries. Something about the timing nagged at her. Burns severe enough to require weeks of hospitalization, a patient with no memory, and a suspicious amount of cash, all occurring just after one of Detroit's most puzzling warehouse fires. The coincidence seemed worth investigating. She ran Torres's name through the hospital's patient database and discovered something even more intriguing. The man had been treated multiple times over the years, always paying in cash and always providing minimal personal information. His most recent visit was in 2023 for routine diabetes management. The address listed on his intake forms had remained consistent for over 2 decades, a modest apartment complex less than 5 miles from where the Riverside Storage Complex had once stood. Santos cross-referenced the name against public death records, a routine verification step in the digitization process. What she found defied explanation. According to the Social Security Death Master file, Michael Torres had died on February 14, 1983, the exact date of the warehouse fire. The death certificate listed the cause as smoke inhalation and severe burns sustained in an industrial accident. Yet, hospital records showed the same man receiving medical treatment for decades after his supposed death. The discrepancy was so glaring that Santos assumed it was a clerical error, perhaps 2 different men with the same name whose records had been confused over the years. But when she compared the Social Security numbers, dates of birth, and physical descriptions, the match was perfect. Michael Torres had been officially declared dead on the night of the warehouse fire, yet continued living, breathing, and requiring medical care for the next 41 years. Santos brought the anomaly to her supervisor, who initially dismissed it as a database error. Death certificates were occasionally filed incorrectly, especially during chaotic events like major fires where multiple casualties were processed simultaneously. but when they pulled the original paper records and compared them against digital archives, the documentation was consistent. The same man appeared to have died and survived the same incident. The supervisor escalated the matter to the hospital's legal department, who recognized the potential implications immediately. If Michael Torres was alive despite being legally dead, it suggested fraud on a scale that could involve insurance companies, government benefits, and decades of false identity documentation. The legal team contacted the Detroit Police Department's Fraud Division, who agreed to investigate the discrepancy as a potential case of identity theft or insurance fraud. Detective Raymond Clark had seen plenty of unusual cases during his 15 years with the Fraud Division, but the Torres file presented a puzzle unlike anything in his experience. A man declared dead who continued living openly, seeking medical treatment under his real name at the same hospital system where his death had been recorded. If Torres was attempting to defraud insurance companies or government agencies, he was doing so with remarkable carelessness. Clark began by pulling the original police report from the 1983 warehouse fire. The file was thin, containing little more than basic incident documentation, and the fire department's determination that the blaze was accidental. But buried in the supplementary reports was a victim list that included Michael Torres, age 28, found unconscious near the loading dock area with severe burns. The report noted that Torres had been transported to Detroit Medical Center, where he was later pronounced dead from his injuries. The contradiction was immediate and undeniable. Hospital records showed Torres surviving his injuries and being discharged after 6 weeks of treatment. Police records showed him dying from those same injuries on the night he was admitted. Someone had filed a false death certificate, but the question was whether it had been done deliberately or through administrative error. Clark requested the original death certificate from the Wayne County Clerk's office and discovered another layer to the mystery. The document bore the signature of Dr. Harold Reeves, an emergency room physician who had worked at Detroit Medical Center during the early 1980s. According to the certificate, Reeves had pronounced Torres dead at 3:47 a.m. on February 15, 1983. But when Clark cross-referenced hospital staffing records, he found that Dr. Reeves had not been on duty that night. The physician had been attending a medical conference in Chicago and didn't return to Detroit until February 17th. The death certificate had been signed by someone who wasn't even in the city when Torres allegedly died. The investigation took on new urgency when Clark discovered that Dr. Reeves himself had died in 1995, making it impossible to question him about the forged signature. But hospital personnel records from 1983 revealed something equally important. During the night Torres was treated, only 3 physicians had been working in the emergency department, and none of them had any record of pronouncing Torres dead, and all of them remembered the case as a successful treatment of severe burn injuries. Clark expanded his investigation to include the original warehouse fire, pulling insurance files that had been gathering dust for 4 decades. The connection became clear when he discovered that Northern Logistics, the mysterious company that had filed the fraudulent insurance claim, had listed Michael Torres as an employee on their business registration documents. The pieces began forming a picture that was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. Torres hadn't been an innocent victim of the warehouse fire. He had been part of whatever operation Northern Logistics was running in Unit 47B. The fire, whether accidental or intentional, had caught him inside the building, and his severe injuries had provided the perfect cover for his disappearance from public records. Someone with access to official documentation had filed the false death certificate, allowing Torres to vanish legally while continuing to live under his real name. It was a sophisticated form of identity laundering that had kept him hidden in plain sight for over 40 years. The question was whether Torres had orchestrated his own fake death, or whether someone else had done it to protect him from the consequences of whatever had been stored in that warehouse. Clark requested surveillance footage from businesses near Torres's apartment complex and discovered that the man was still very much alive and active. He maintained a quiet routine, shopping at local stores, visiting the library, and taking regular walks through his neighborhood. He appeared to live modestly, with no signs of sudden wealth or extravagant spending, but he always paid for everything in cash. The detective faced a delicate situation. Approaching Torres directly could cause him to disappear again, potentially ending any chance of solving the warehouse mystery. But continued surveillance might reveal connections to other individuals involved in the 1983 operation, assuming any of them were still alive and active. Clark decided on a middle approach. Rather than confronting Torres directly, he would build a comprehensive profile of the man's activities over the past 4 decades, looking for patterns that might reveal the truth about the warehouse fire and the missing money. The detective began by pulling financial records, utility bills, and tax filings under Torres's name, creating a timeline of his life since his supposed death. What emerged was the portrait of a man living deliberately below the radar. Torres had never owned property, never applied for credit cards, and never filed tax returns reporting significant income. He rented the same apartment for 23 years, paying monthly rent in cash through a property management company that asked few questions. His utility bills were modest, consistent with someone living alone and maintaining a low profile. But there were anomalies that suggested Torres had access to resources beyond what his lifestyle indicated. Medical records showed he had paid for expensive procedures without insurance, including multiple surgeries and specialized treatments that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. He had never applied for Medicare or Medicaid despite his age, choosing instead to pay cash for all medical services. Clark traced Torres's spending patterns through interviews with local merchants who remembered him as a quiet, reliable customer who always paid in small bills. Store owners described him as polite but private, someone who made purchases quickly and never lingered for conversation. Several mentioned that he seemed to have an endless supply of $20 and $50 bills, unusual for someone with no apparent source of income. The detective's investigation expanded when he discovered that Torres had been making regular trips to a storage facility on Detroit's west side for over 2 decades. The facility's management confirmed that Torres rented a climate-controlled unit under his real name, paying annual fees in advance with cash. The unit was accessed infrequently, perhaps 3 or 4 times per year, always during daylight hours and always alone. Obtaining a warrant for the storage unit required presenting evidence to a judge that Torres was connected to criminal activity. Clark compiled his findings into a comprehensive report showing the false death certificate, the connection to Northern Logistics, and the suspicious financial patterns that suggested Torres had been living off hidden assets for decades. The warrant was approved, and Clark prepared for what he hoped would be the breakthrough the case needed. The storage unit measured 10 feet by 12 feet and was secured with 2 heavy-duty locks. When Clark and his team opened it, they found a space that had been carefully organized and maintained. Metal shelving lined the walls, supporting dozens of sealed plastic containers, each labeled with dates and coded references. A small table sat in the center of the space, surrounded by filing cabinets that appeared to contain decades of documentation. The first container Clark opened contained bundled currency, mostly $20 and $50 bills that showed signs of age, but had been preserved in excellent condition. The bills were sorted by denomination and secured with rubber bands, each bundle containing exactly $1,000. A quick count revealed over 30 bundles in the first container alone. Additional containers held similar bundles, along with gold coins, silver bars, and small jewelry items that appeared valuable, but were difficult to identify without expert appraisal. Clark estimated the total value of the contents at several $100,000, a fortune that Torres had apparently been drawing from gradually over the years to support his modest lifestyle. But the real revelation came from the filing cabinets. Torres had maintained meticulous records of his activities since 1983, including detailed logs of his medical treatments, living expenses, and financial transactions. More importantly, he had preserved documents related to Northern Logistics and the warehouse operation that had been destroyed in the fire. Among the papers was a handwritten journal that chronicled Torres's involvement in what appeared to have been a complex money laundering operation. According to his notes, Northern Logistics had been a front for processing cash from various illegal activities, converting dirty money into legitimate assets that could be stored and transported without detection. The warehouse unit had served as a temporary holding facility for currency, waiting to be cleaned through false business transactions. Torres's journal revealed that he had been recruited for the operation through connections in Detroit's underground economy. His job was to oversee the physical security of the stored cash and coordinate with drivers who made regular pickups and deliveries. He was paid well for his services but kept minimal records and asked few questions about the money's origins. The fire had occurred during a routine transfer operation, when Torres was alone in the unit conducting an inventory of stored currency. According to his account, an electrical surge had triggered a small explosion in the building's main power distribution panel, which was located directly above Unit 47B. Sparks ignited stored materials in adjacent units, and the fire spread rapidly through the interconnected spaces. Torres had been overcome by smoke while trying to salvage what he could from the burning unit. He managed to grab several containers of cash before collapsing near the loading dock, where firefighters found him unconscious. During his hospitalization, he realized that his apparent death provided an opportunity to disappear from the operation entirely, keeping the money he had saved while avoiding prosecution for his role in the laundering scheme. The false death certificate had been arranged by Dr. Reeves, who was also involved in the money laundering operation. Reeves had access to official forms and knew how to file documentation without triggering immediate verification. In exchange for creating Torres's fake death, Reeves had received a substantial payment and assurance that his own involvement would remain secret. Torres's journal indicated that the total amount of cash destroyed in the fire had been closer to $4 million, not the $2.2 million claimed by Northern Logistics. The insurance claim had been filed for a smaller amount to avoid attracting excessive attention from investigators. The money Torres had salvaged represented only a fraction of what had been lost, but it was enough to support him for decades if managed carefully. As Clark read through the journal, he realized that Torres's case was both more and less significant than he had initially believed. The man had committed fraud by allowing himself to be declared dead, but he had also been a relatively minor player in a much larger criminal enterprise. The real architects of the money laundering operation had likely escaped justice decades ago, leaving Torres to live quietly off the remnants of their illegal proceeds. The detective faced a complex decision about how to proceed. Torres was clearly guilty of multiple crimes, including filing false documents and tax evasion. But he was also an aging man whose crimes were decades old and whose victims were primarily insurance companies and government agencies rather than individual citizens. Prosecuting him would likely yield little beyond symbolic justice, especially given the statute of limitations on many potential charges. Clark's investigation had also revealed information about a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated in Detroit during the 1980s. The money laundering operation had processed millions of dollars in illegal proceeds, potentially connected to drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and other organized criminal activities. While the principals were likely dead or beyond prosecution, the information could prove valuable for understanding historical crime patterns and identifying ongoing criminal networks. The detective compiled his findings into a comprehensive report for his supervisors, outlining the evidence against Torres while also documenting the broader implications of the case. He recommended pursuing charges for the most serious offenses while also exploring whether Torres might be willing to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced penalties. Meanwhile, Torres continued his quiet routine, unaware that his 4-decade secret had finally been discovered. He made his regular trips to the grocery store, visited his doctor for routine checkups, and maintained the modest lifestyle that had kept him hidden for so long. The careful balance he had maintained between visibility and invisibility was about to be disrupted by forces beyond his control. The case that had begun with a warehouse fire and a fraudulent insurance claim was approaching its resolution, but the final chapters would depend on decisions made by prosecutors, judges, and Torres himself. The missing $2.2 million had been found, along with the man who was supposed to have died trying to protect it. But the larger questions about justice, redemption, and the statute of limitations on decades-old crimes remained to be answered. Clark prepared for what would likely be the most delicate arrest of his career, knowing that approaching Torres would mark the end of one of Detroit's longest-running mysteries, while potentially opening new questions about the criminal enterprises that had thrived in the city's shadows during its darkest economic period. On a crisp October morning in 2024, Detective Clark knocked on the door of Apartment 3B at the Riverside Gardens complex. The building was modest, its brick facade weathered by decades of Detroit winters, but maintained well enough to house working families and retirees seeking affordable housing. Clark had rehearsed this moment countless times, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether 41 years of careful deception would end in cooperation or catastrophe. The man who answered the door appeared older than his 69 years, with silver hair and the careful movements of someone who had endured significant physical trauma. Michael Torres looked exactly as Clark had expected from surveillance photos, but seeing him in person carried a weight that surveillance could never capture. This was a man who had been legally dead for 4 decades, yet stood before him very much alive. Torres showed no surprise at seeing the detective. His expression remained calm, almost resigned, as if he had been expecting this visit for years. Clark introduced himself and explained the purpose of his call, watching carefully for signs of panic or attempts to flee. Instead, Torres simply nodded and invited him inside. The apartment was sparse but clean, furnished with items that looked decades old but well-maintained. Family photographs lined a bookshelf, showing Torres at various ages with people Clark assumed were relatives or friends. Medical equipment sat discreetly in one corner, testament to the ongoing health challenges that had brought Torres to the hospital and ultimately exposed his secret. Torres offered coffee and took a seat across from Clark at a small dining table. The detective had prepared for various scenarios, from violent resistance to complete denial, but Torres's calm acceptance caught him off guard. When Clark presented the evidence linking him to the warehouse fire and the fraudulent death certificate, Torres listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if confirming details he remembered well. After Clark finished his presentation, Torres was quiet for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of carefully maintained silence. He acknowledged his role in the money laundering operation, the circumstances of his supposed death, and his life in hiding since 1983, but he also revealed information that Clark had not uncovered in his investigation. The operation behind Northern Logistics had been far more extensive than the detective had realized. Torres described a network that had processed millions of dollars in illegal proceeds through dozens of front companies across the Midwest. The warehouse fire had been devastating, not just because of the money destroyed, but because it had compromised an entire infrastructure of financial crime that had taken years to establish. Torres named individuals who had been involved in the operation, though most were dead or had disappeared decades ago. Dr. Reeves, who had arranged the false death certificate, had been found murdered in 1995. His death initially attributed to a robbery, but now appearing more sinister in light of Torres's revelations. Other key figures had died in apparent accidents or had simply vanished, leaving Torres as potentially the only surviving witness to the entire enterprise. The money Torres had salvaged represented a fraction of what had been lost, but he had managed it carefully over the decades. He estimated that he had spent roughly $8,000 per year supporting his modest lifestyle, stretching the remaining funds across 4 decades of careful budgeting. The storage unit contained what remained of his share, along with documentation he had preserved as insurance against potential prosecution. Clark found himself in an unusual position as Torres's confession unfolded. The man was clearly guilty of multiple serious crimes, but he was also providing information about criminal enterprises that law enforcement had never fully understood. Torres offered complete cooperation in exchange for consideration of his age, health, and the decades that had passed since his crimes were committed. The detective spent 3 hours in Torres's apartment, recording testimony that filled gaps in numerous cold cases from the 1980s. Torres provided details about money laundering techniques, identified locations where other operations had been conducted, and named individuals who might still be alive and active in criminal enterprises. The information was potentially invaluable for understanding historical crime patterns and identifying ongoing investigations, but Torres also made it clear that his cooperation came with conditions. He had maintained his silence for 40 years, not just to protect himself, but to protect family members who had no knowledge of his activities. He had children and grandchildren who believed he was simply a retiree living on modest savings. Exposing his criminal past would devastate people who had committed no crimes themselves. Clark understood the complexity of the situation. Prosecuting Torres would likely result in minimal jail time given his age and health, but it would destroy relationships and lives that had been built on decades of carefully maintained deception. The detective also recognized that Torres's information about historical criminal enterprises was more valuable than punishment for crimes committed by an aging man who posed no current threat to public safety. The case was referred to the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, where attorneys face the same difficult balance between justice and practical considerations. Torres had clearly committed serious crimes, but the passage of time and his cooperation complicated any decision about prosecution. The financial losses he had caused were primarily absorbed by insurance companies and government agencies rather than individual victims. After weeks of deliberation, prosecutors reached an unusual agreement with Torres and his attorney. He would plead guilty to reduced charges related to filing false documents and tax evasion, receiving a sentence of probation and community service rather than jail time. In exchange, he would provide complete cooperation with ongoing investigations and forfeit all remaining assets from his original crimes. The storage unit contents were seized and liquidated, with proceeds going to the insurance companies that had absorbed losses from the warehouse fire. Torres agreed to work with federal investigators on cases related to money laundering and organized crime from the 1980s, sharing information that could help solve other cold cases or identify ongoing criminal activities. The resolution brought closure to one of Detroit's most puzzling mysteries, but it also raised questions about the nature of justice and redemption. Torres had committed serious crimes and lived off illegal proceeds for decades. Yet his cooperation provided law enforcement with valuable information about criminal enterprises they had never fully understood. For the insurance company that had paid out the fraudulent claim in 1983, the case represented a rare victory in recovering losses from decades-old fraud. For law enforcement, it demonstrated the value of modern data analysis and cross-referencing systems in solving cases that had seemed hopeless using older investigative methods. Torres returned to his quiet routine, now under supervised probation, but no longer carrying the burden of his secret. He continued living in the same apartment, receiving medical care at the same hospital, and maintaining the modest lifestyle that had sustained him for 4 decades. The only difference was that his existence was now official, his identity restored after 41 years of legal death. The warehouse fire that had consumed Unit 47B in 1983 had taken more than just money and merchandise. It had consumed lives, relationships, and futures in ways that no insurance claim could quantify, but it had also preserved something unexpected: a man's determination to disappear completely while remaining visible, to die officially while continuing to live, and to maintain silence while preserving the truth for the day it would finally be needed. The missing $2.2 million had been found, not in hidden bank accounts or buried treasure, but in the careful calculations of a man who had stretched stolen money across 4 decades of survival. The mystery that had puzzled investigators for 41 years was solved not by brilliant detective work or advanced forensics, but by the simple act of a hospital employee doing her job and noticing something that didn't belong. In the end, Michael Torres's story became more than just a tale of fraud and deception. It became a testament to the power of time to reveal truth, the importance of careful record-keeping, and the unexpected ways that justice can finally emerge from the shadows of the past. The man who was supposed to have died in 1983 had lived to see 2024, and with his cooperation, ensured that the full story of the warehouse fire would finally be told.